The boy reached him first with his eyes, and I am the only one who saw it happen, because I sell roasted chestnuts from a cart 11 steps from the south gate, and I watched that long stone rode the way other men watch the sky for weather. It was a Thursday in the cold end of autumn, the changing of the guard, and the crowd was 4 bodies deep along the marching route when a small hand came out of the press of coats and closed around the white glove of the guardsman called Edrin Vale. He did not look down. He could not look down, that is the whole of his training, the whole of the iron he is made to carry, but I saw the boy, and the boy was not crying, and that, I would learn, was the most frightening thing of all. I have stood at this cart for 19 years. My name is Tomas Fair, and I am nobody, a vendor, a man with chapped hands and a tin of coals, but a man who sells to the same street for 19 years learns to read it. I know the rhythm of that route the way I know my own breathing. The barricades go up at the quarter hour. The drum starts somewhere past the inner court, a slow heartbeat of a thing, and the relief column comes down the cobbles in perfect time, bearskins black as a winter pond, red tunics like a wound against the gray stone of the old Harrogate Palace. The tourists lift their phones, the children point, and the guards do not move their faces, not for the cold, not for the crowd, not for anything God or man puts in front of them. That stillness is what they have all come to see. That is the show. But there is no show in a boy who does not cry. He was perhaps 7, maybe a little less, in a too large green coat with a hood fallen back, dark hair stuck to his forehead though the day was freezing. He had come through the barricade somehow, ducked under a rail or slipped through a gap between hips, and he had crossed the empty stone road that no one is permitted to cross during the change. He had walked straight to the nearest motionless man in red and taken hold of his glove the way a drowning person takes hold of a rope, not pulling, holding. As if the holding itself were the only thing keeping him above the water. I shouted, "I will tell you that first, so you do not think I stood and did nothing." I shouted, boy, come back here," and my voice was eaten by the drum and the crowd and the wind, and the boy did not turn his head. He did not flinch. A child who hears a man bellow 3 steps behind him turns. This one did not. And in that half-second a cold understanding went through me, the kind that arrives before you have words for it. He had not heard me. He had not heard the drum either. He had walked into the most rule-bound place in the kingdom, and laid hold of a soldier of the king, because the world he lived in had no sound in it. And so, the rules made of sound and command meant nothing to him at all. The guardsman Vale felt the hand. I know he did, because I have watched these men for 19 years and I know the difference between stone and a man being stone, and something crossed the back of his neck, a tightening, a held breath you would never catch unless you had nothing to do all day but watch. His eyes stayed forward. His rifle stayed at his shoulder. Procedure does not bend for a hand. A guard on the change does not stop, does not speak, does not so much as drop his gaze. The sergeant marching the column behind him would see it. The inspecting officer would mark it. And there are men whose entire careers are the measure of how perfectly they did not move when something moved against them. To break is to fail. Everyone on that route knew it. The boy did not and could not and held on. Then the column came on. That is the thing the tourists do not understand about the change. It is not a parade that waits for you. The relief comes down the route at a fixed pace, boots striking the cobbles like a clock that has no mercy in it, and the marching sergeant calls the time, and the men who are to take the new posts come on whether the road is clear or not, because clearing the road is somebody else's job, and trusting that it is clear is part of the discipline. I heard the boots change rhythm at the top of the rise. I heard the sergeant's voice, flat and carrying, and I saw the front rank of the relief column round the corner of the gatehouse 40 yards off, and start down the open stone toward the very spot where a deaf boy in a green coat stood holding a soldier's glove with his back to all of it. 40 yards is nothing to a marching column. 40 yards is a handful of seconds. I came around my cart. I want you to know I came around my cart, knocked the tin of coals and did not care, and I got 2 steps before a constable's arm took me across the chest like a gate slamming shut. "Back of the line," he said, not even looking at me, his eyes on the column, on the crowd, on everything except the small green shape in the middle of the road. He had not seen the boy yet. In all that red and black and noise, in a crowd of 1,000 lifted phones, one still child had become invisible, the one place none of us was trained to look. But Vale had seen. Vale, who could not turn his head, had seen all the same out of the bottom of his eyes, the way a man sees a thing he is forbidden to look at, the way you feel a fire you are told not to face. I watched his jaw. I watched the white glove that the boy was holding, and I watched the other glove, the one on the rifle, and I saw the knuckles go from rest to ready, the smallest thing, a man's hand deciding something while the rest of him stayed a statue. The drum kept its heartbeat. The boots came on. The sergeant's voice called the count, and the front rank was 30 yards out now, then 25, and the boy felt none of it, heard none of it, stood there with his small face turned up toward a man who was looking straight over his head at the cold gray sky as if the boy were not there at all. I have asked myself 100 times since what I would have done in that red coat. I have decided I do not know. To move was to fail in front of his sergeant, his regiment, the watching crowd, the whole ironclad faith that these men do not break. To not move was, I could not finish the thought then, and I can barely finish it now. 20 yards. The boy's fingers tightened on the glove. And somewhere in the crowd, far back, a woman's voice rose, frayed at the edges, calling a name into the wind. A name no one answered because the only one it belonged to could not hear it being called. Vale's chin dropped 1 degree. 1. The smallest break of the line of his gaze, the first crack in 19 years of stone I had ever seen on that road. And for one breath the immovable man and the unhearing boy looked at each other, and I swear to you on my cart in my 19 years, that something passed between them that the rest of us, with all our hearing and all our rules, were not quick enough to catch. The boots came on. The constable's arm was iron across my chest. And the front rank of the column was 15 yards from a child, who did not know he was standing in the path of the king's own marching men. What Vale did then I have replayed more nights than I can count, and I still cannot find the place where a man decides such a thing. He did not shout, he could not, and it would not have reached the boy anyway. He did not step back into the safety of his post and let the column part around the child or, God forbid, not part. He turned his rifle. Slow, controlled, the way these men do everything. He brought the weapon down from his shoulder and across his own body. And with the flat of it and the iron of his arm he made a barrier, a low gate of red wool and brass and disciplined muscle. And in the same breath his free hand, the white glove the boy had been holding, closed gently over those small fingers and drew the boy in against his side, behind the line of his own body, between the child and the oncoming boots. Then he stopped marching the future he was supposed to march into. He simply stopped, and stood his ground in the open road where no man stands during the change, and put himself between 15 yards of disciplined momentum and a boy who could not hear it coming. The sergeant saw it. I heard the count break, that flat carrying voice stumbled for half a syllable, and a column that has not stumbled in 300 years felt the stumble run back through its ranks like a shiver down a spine. The front rank, men trained to march through everything short of a wall, saw one of their own turned sideways in the road with his rifle across his body, and a small green shape sheltered behind his arm, and they did the only thing such men can do when discipline meets discipline. They halted, not in confusion, in recognition. The boots came down hard, once, twice, and stopped, and the whole red and black river of them came to a standstill 10 feet from Edrin Vale and the boy he had taken out of the water. The crowd did not understand at first. I heard the phones, the murmur, the rising note of 1,000 people sensing that the show had broken its own rules and not knowing yet whether to be delighted or afraid. The constable's arm came off my chest. He had finally seen, they had all finally seen, the child. And in the new silence, where the drum had faltered and the boots had stilled, that frayed woman's voice came again from far back in the press, closer now, fighting through the bodies, calling the name that no answer ever came to. And this time the whole crowd heard the breaking in it, and the crowd that had come to watch men not move went very still itself. Vale had not let go of the boy. That is the part I keep. A man who has just shattered the most sacred routine of his service, with his sergeant's eyes on him and the whole crowd's lenses turned his way and his career hanging in that cold air like breath. That man did not look up to plead his case, did not look for permission, did not look at anyone but the child. He had gone down on one knee. The rifle was grounded, but to the cobbles, his hand still around it but at rest now, no longer a barrier because the boots had stopped and the barrier was no longer needed. And he had turned his stone face down toward the boy, and the stone was gone from it. I was close enough now. The constable, God bless him, had pulled me through the rail to help, the two of us nearest to it of all that crowd, close enough to see Vale's face do the thing none of us had ever seen it do. He was not speaking. He had understood the way I had understood, that words were a country this boy could not visit, so he spoke the other way. He lifted his white-gloved hand, slow so as not to frighten, and he touched his own chest flat over the brass buttons and the red wool and whatever heart beats under all that iron, and then he turned the same hand toward the boy, open, palm up. Here I am. You are here. A whole sentence with no sound in it. And the boy, who had not cried, who had walked into the lion's road dry-eyed because the world had taught him young that crying brought no one when no one could hear you, the boy's face came apart at last. Not in fear. In the terrible relief of a child who has been holding himself together alone for far longer than a child should ever have to, and has finally found a grown person looking right at him and saying, in the only language he had, "You are not invisible to me." His shoulders shook. Vale did not flinch from it. He brought the boy in against the red wool and the cold brass, one white glove at the back of that dark head, and he held him there in the middle of the marching route, while 300 years of unbroken protocol stood at a halt around them and did not say a word. I felt the constable beside me let out a breath he must have been holding since the boots first stopped. Somewhere a woman in the crowd was weeping openly. The phones were still up. They are always up, but the chatter had drained out of them, and what was left was the sound of a great many strangers holding still for a thing they had not come for and would not forget. But it was not over. It could not be over because a boy alone in that crowd is a boy who has lost something, and I had heard the something, that frayed voice, that unanswered name, and I knew, the way you know weather, that the hardest part was still coming down the road toward us. The sergeant had come forward. A big man, older, with the kind of face that has spent 30 years being unreadable for a living, and on it now was an expression I could not name, not anger, not yet, but the held judgment of a man who has just watched one of his own commit the unthinkable and must decide, in front of everyone, what it was. He stopped over the kneeling guardsman and the weeping boy. The crowd's breath caught all together. And I thought, here it comes. Here is where the rules take their due, where the iron that bent gets punished for bending, where a good man pays for the only decent thing any of us had seen all day. The sergeant looked at the boy. He looked a long moment at the boy. Then he did something I have never seen a marching sergeant do in 19 years on that stone. He went down on one knee too. He did not touch the child, he left that to Vale, who had earned it, but he brought his big, unreadable face down to the boy's level, and he made the same sign Vale had made, fist flat to the chest, then the open hand. He had read it. In one glance the man had read the whole of it, the silence, the dry eyes, the green coat, the held hand, and instead of correcting his guardsman he had joined him. The crowd made a sound then, low and warm, the sound a crowd makes when it sees the right thing happen and can hardly believe it is being allowed to watch. I learned the sergeant's name later, Havard. 31 years on the gates, 2 sons of his own grown and gone, and a daughter, someone told me, who had been born without her hearing and lived in a quiet world he had spent half his life learning to enter. I do not know if that part is true. I know what I saw, and what I saw was a man who knew exactly what that boy's silence meant. and who had decided in the space of one breath that there are some rules a service is right to break, and some it would be a sin to keep. "Find the mother," Havard said. He did not raise his voice, and he did not need to. Two guardsmen broke from the halted column, broke from the formation, another impossibility on that road, and moved into the crowd toward the far rail where that frayed voice had been climbing toward us. The barricades that keep the public back came open from the inside, which they are never, ever supposed to do, and the constables who guard them stepped aside, because every man in a uniform on that route had understood in the same instant that something larger than the routine was being served, and not one of them was willing to be the man who stood in its way. She came through fast when they reached her, a young woman, coatless, as if she had run out of somewhere without stopping for anything, her face the particular gray of a parent who has been searching a crowd for a child she cannot call to by voice and cannot expect to come when called. She had been doing the impossible arithmetic of it, searching for a boy who could not hear her shout his name, in a press of 1,000 strangers, against a tide of bodies all moving the wrong way. I have thought since about what those minutes must have been for her, and I have to stop thinking about it, because there is a particular cruelty in a fear that has no sound to it, a mother running silent through a roaring crowd. She broke through the last of the bodies and she saw him. I will not be able to do the next part justice. The boy felt her before he saw her, felt the crowd part, felt the change in the air, the way the deaf feel so much that the rest of us let our ears do for us. And his head came up off Vale's red wool and he turned, and the two of them, the mother and the son, found each other across 10 feet of cold cobblestone in front of the king's halted guard. She did not run the last steps. She could not, her legs would not have her. She came down onto her knees on the stone, and he came out of Vale's arms and into hers, and the two of them folded together in the middle of the marching route, and her hands were going everywhere. His face, his hair, his shoulders, the way a mother's hands check that a child is whole, and her mouth was moving in the silent shapes I would come to learn she and her son shared, the words that lived in their hands and their faces instead of the air. He was nodding against her. He was safe. He was found. And the king's guard, the whole halted column of them, the iron men who do not move, stood around that reunion like a wall of red and watched it happen, and let it have all the time it needed. Vale had risen. He had taken up his rifle and come back to attention, a statue again, but a statue with something different in the set of his shoulders now, and I understood that he had not broken his discipline at all, not truly. He had spent it. He had taken the whole great store of an honorable man's restraint, the not moving and the not speaking and the not feeling that he had banked across all his years on that post, and he had spent every coin of it at once on the one thing it was ever really for. The stillness had never been the point. The stillness was the savings. This was the purchase. The mother looked up. She found Vale among all the red coats. She knew him at once, the one who had knelt, and she pressed her son to her with one arm and brought her free hand to her lips and then out toward the guardsman, the sign I now know means thank you, carried on the air between them where no spoken thanks could have reached. Vale could not return it. He was at attention, eyes forward, the iron back in place. But Sergeant Havard was not bound by a post in that moment, and Havard, standing beside his guardsman, brought his own gloved hand to his lips and out toward the mother. "Thank you," the king's own sergeant said back to her, in her son's language, and the crowd, which had been so quiet, could not hold its quiet any longer. I have heard applause on that route 1,000 times, the polite applause tourists give a parade. This was not that. This came up out of the crowd like something released, like a held breath let go all at once, hands and voices, strangers turning to strangers, a few of them openly crying and not minding who saw. It rolled down the length of the marching route and broke against the old gray stone of the gatehouse and came back again. And in the middle of it, the boy turned his face out of his mother's shoulder, because he had felt it, felt the great pressure of all that sound he could not hear roll over him like a warmth. And he looked around at the crowd with wide, wet eyes, And for the first time since he had come out of that press of coats and taken hold of a soldier's glove, the boy in the green coat smiled. That smile is the thing I would sell my cart to keep. That is the thing the phones caught, the thing that went out from that cold Thursday into the world and could not be stopped, the small bewildered joy of a child learning all at once that 1,000 strangers and a wall of the king's own men had stood still for him. For him, the unhearing one, the invisible one, the boy who had walked into the lion's road because the lion's road frightened him less than being alone in the crowd. He smiled, and the crowd saw the smile, and the crowd came apart entirely. I thought that was the end of it. A reunion, a sergeant's mercy, a crowd's tears, a fine thing, a thing to tell at the cart for years. But I had forgotten where I was standing. I had forgotten that the change of the guard does not happen by accident, that it is watched, always, from windows I never look up at, by men whose business is to know what happens on that route before the rest of us have finished feeling it. And so I was as surprised as anyone when a side door in the gatehouse opened, a door I had seen stay shut for 19 years, and an officer in a long dark coat came down the steps onto the cobbles, walking toward the halted column and the kneeling mother and the boy, with the unhurried certainty of a man who answers to almost no one. The crowd's applause faltered, the guardsmen stiffened, and Sergeant Havard rose to his full height and turned to meet whatever was coming. I confess I feared for Vale then. I had told myself the sergeant's mercy was the end of his danger, but I knew better. A guardsman who breaks the change is not judged by the crowd that loves him for it. He is judged by the service, by the cold men who care nothing for a vendor's tears, who measure a soldier by whether he held the line and nothing else. And here came one of those men, surely, down the forbidden steps to deliver the reckoning. I have lived long enough to know that the world does not often let a beautiful thing simply be beautiful. It comes back with a bill. The officer reached the column. Up close he was older than his straight back had suggested, silver at the temples, a long row of ribbon on his chest that meant more than I could read, and a face that had clearly spent a career learning to give nothing away, the senior version of the very stillness Vale wore. The whole route held its breath. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the phones. He stopped in front of Sergeant Havard, and the two men exchanged a look I will not pretend to have understood, and then the officer's eyes went past the sergeant to the guardsman standing rigid at attention, eyes forward, the man who had knelt. "You left your post," the officer said. His voice was quiet, and it carried the way Havard's had carried, the way authority carries when it has never once had to shout to be obeyed. "You grounded your weapon on the change. You halted the relief of the KingsGuard on a public route in full view. A pause that opened under us like a trapdoor. Is that correct, guardsman?" "Yes, sir." Vale did not move his eyes. He did not reach for an excuse. A disciplined man does not explain himself. He answers and he takes what comes. "It is correct, sir." The officer let the silence run. He was a man who knew the weight of a silence and how to spend it. The mother had gone very still over her son, sensing without understanding that the man who had saved her boy was standing in some danger of his own. The crowd did not breathe. And I stood at the broken rail with my cold hands and thought, not him, not for this. Do not take this man for the only right thing done on this stone in years. "In 31 years, the officer said at last, "I have relieved men of this duty for far less." He turned slowly, and for the first time he looked at the boy, really looked, the way Vale had looked, the way the sergeant had looked, the long, careful look of a man taking in the green coat and the dry tracks on the small face and the silence that hung about the childlike weather. Something moved behind the officer's careful face. "Far less," he said again, more quietly, and it was not a threat anymore. It was something closer to grief. Men who flinched at a shout, men who turned their heads for a pretty face in the crowd. Men who forgot the moment they were tested what the uniform is for. He came back to Vale. "Do you know what it is for, guardsmen?" "To stand, sir." Vale's voice did not waver. "And to guard." "To guard," the officer repeated. "Not to stand. The standing is the lesser word, though it is the one the whole world watches us do. We stand so that we are ready to guard. And when the day finally comes that the standing and the guarding ask for different things, he stopped. And I watched a lifetime of restraint cost him something to say the next part aloud in the open, in front of the crowd and the lenses. A man who chooses the standing over the guarding has understood nothing. You chose correctly, Guardsman Vale. You chose the only thing worth all the standing. Do not let me hear you apologize for it. I did not understand at first that we had been spared. The crowd understood before I did. I heard it move through them, the meaning of it, and then the sound came up again, but lower this time, a kind of rumble of approval rather than the wild release of before, the sound of grown men and women agreeing with something in their chests. The officer turned to the sergeant. Sergeant Havard, the relief is fouled and the root is broken. What do you intend to do about it? And old Havard, who had knelt on the king's stone for a deaf boy not a quarter hour before, said, "Reform the column, sir, and complete the change. Once the boy is home." He said it like a man who knew his commander, and the officer almost let the corner of his mouth move. "Once the boy is home," the officer agreed. "Carry on, sergeant." And then, before he turned to go, he did the last thing I expected, the thing I have told most often of all the things I saw that day. He stepped past the sergeant, past the rigid line of guardsmen, and he came to a stop in front of the mother and the boy. He was a man, I would learn, of considerable rank, a man whose nod could end careers, who answered to the household and almost nothing below it. And he lowered himself, in his long dark coat with all his ribbon, to one knee on the cold cobblestone in front of a coatless young woman and her son. He did not know the silent language. You could see that he did not, his hands hesitated, unsure. But he had watched, and he was a man who learned fast, and he brought his gloved hand up to his chest the way the others had and then turned it open toward the boy. Clumsy, sincere. The boy looked at this gray-templed stranger with all his ribbon and his forbidding face, and then the boy lifted his own small hand and made the sign back fist to the chest, then the open palm, and a thing happened to the officer's face that I do not have the words for, a crack in the oldest stone of all, there and gone, mastered before the crowd could be sure they had seen it. He rose. He inclined his head to the mother, once, the way one bows to an equal and not to a subject. And he climbed the forbidden steps and went back through the door that had been shut for 19 years, and it closed behind him, and the matter was settled. They walked the boy home in the end or to the edge of the public ground, where the mother's own people were waiting, white-faced, having lost the two of them in the crowd. 2 guardsmen went as escort, red coats parting the press of people, and the boy walked between them holding the mother's hand and for a few steps, holding the white glove of one of the guardsmen too, the way he had held Vale's, except that this time the holding was not drowning. This time it was a boy walking with friends. He looked back once. He looked back at Edrin Vale, who had reformed into the line and stood at his post again, returned to stone, eyes forward, the change about to be completed as though it had never been broken. And the boy lifted his hand and made the sign one more time across all that distance, "Thank you," and Vale, who could not move, who was a statue again, who would be marked and noted and, I am told, never once reprimanded for any of it, Vale did not return the sign. He could not, he was on the change. But I was close and I was watching, the way I always watch, and I will swear to my last day that as the boy turned away the white glove on that grounded rifle moved, just the thumb, just the smallest fraction, a private answer no sergeant would ever catch and no officer would ever mark, sent across the cobblestones to a boy who lived in a world of small movements and would understand it better than any of us. You are welcome. You were never invisible. Go home. The column reformed. The drum found its heartbeat again. The boots took up their merciless clock, and the change of the guard completed itself the way it has completed itself for 300 years, as though the stone had never been broken, and a deaf boy had never stood in the Lion's Road, and a sergeant had never knelt. The tourists drifted back to their phones and their maps. The barricades closed, And I went back around my cart and picked up my spilled coals one at a time, my hands shaking, though it was not from the cold. I want to tell you how it sat with me after, because that is the part the phones did not catch, the part that is mine. For 19 years I had sold chestnuts to people who came to watch men not move. I had thought I understood the show. I had thought the whole of it was the stillness, the marvel of a man who could be spat at and shouted at and stand there like a wall, the discipline that made tourists shake their heads and say they could never do it. I had it backward. I had it exactly backward, and it took a silent boy in a green coat to turn me around. The stillness was never the point. I had been admiring the wrong thing for 19 years. A wall is not admirable for being a wall. It is admirable for what it keeps out and what it keeps safe. All that iron discipline, all that not moving the crowd came to gawk at, it was never about a man proving he could be a statue. It was about a man making himself strong enough, patient enough, unbreakable enough that when the one moment came, the moment that asked for everything, he would have something left to give. Vale had stood through years of insults so that he would be standing ready on the day a child needed him. The stillness was the long preparation. The kneeling was the whole purpose of it. And the great cruel joke of the change of the guard is that almost no one who watches it will ever see the day it is actually for. I saw it. I am a vendor with chapped hands and a tin of coals and no importance to anyone, and I happened to be standing 11 steps from the south gate on the one cold Thursday when the wall came down off its post and showed the whole watching world what it had been for all along. I learned a little more in the weeks after, the way you do, in pieces, from the constable who became a friend of mine over that winter. The mother had brought the boy to the gates one bright morning before, just the two of them, on an ordinary visit to see the famous guards, and in the press of the crowd at the change they had been separated, a moment, a turned back, a tide of bodies, and a boy who could not hear his name called, and a mother who could not call to him in any way the crowd would carry. She had searched for the better part of a quarter hour, the constable said, going slowly out of her mind in the silent way of her family, before any of us at the front of the route ever knew there was a child loose among the marching men. And the boy had done the bravest, most frightening, most sensible thing a child in his world could do. He had looked for the stillest, surest, most unmistakable grown-up in all that roaring confusion, the one figure that stood out from the moving crowd like a lighthouse stands out from a storm, the one who would not be jostled away or swept off or lost, and he had walked straight to him and taken hold and held on. The unmoving man had become the only thing in the boy's whole frightening world that he could trust not to move, the only safe harbor in the storm. I think about that more than I think about anything else from that day. A child who could not hear, lost in the loudest place in the city, found safety not in the noise and not in the crowd, and not in any of the well-meaning strangers who might have helped him if they had only seen him. He found it in the one man who looked like he would never let himself be moved, and he was right. By everything that man had been trained to be, the boy should have been wrong, should have grabbed at a statue and been ignored, marched past, swept aside by the clock of the boots. Instead, the statue had a heart in it after all, the way the best of them always do, the heart the discipline is built to protect and not to bury. The boy bet his safety on the stillness of the King's Guard, and the King's Guard paid out. They never named Vale in the thing that went around the world. The phones caught the red coat and the kneeling and the boy's smile and the sergeant's silent "thank you," but they never caught his name, and I have come to think he would have wanted it that way. These men are not in it to be known. I knew his name only because I had stood at that gate for 19 years and made it my business to know the men I sold to in the cold. He came past my cart a few weeks later, off duty, in an ordinary coat, an ordinary man you would never look at twice. I gave him chestnuts and would not take his coin. He understood why and did not insult me by arguing. He only nodded, that small, weighted nod these men have, and for a moment the iron came off his face the way it had on the cobblestones, and he said the only words he ever said to me about any of it. "I almost didn't," he said. "2 more seconds and I would have talked myself out of it. The whole weight of the thing, the post, the column, the sergeant, all of it, it was telling me to stand. It is very loud, that voice, even though it never makes a sound. He looked down the long stone route where he had spent his years, and then I felt how small his hand was, and I thought, if I stand here and let the boots come, then everything I have been standing for is a lie. So I moved. He almost smiled. And it turned out the whole regiment had been waiting their whole lives to move too. They just needed one of us to do it first. He took his chestnuts and went, and I never saw him at my cart again, though I see him still on the route some mornings, back at his post, a statue among statues, eyes forward, giving the watching tourists exactly the stillness they came for and nothing of what is underneath it. They take their photographs. They marvel at the discipline. They go home and tell their friends about the men who would not move for anything. They have it backward, the same as I did, and there is no way to tell them. You cannot explain to a man with a camera that the marvel is not the not moving, that the not moving is only the long, patient, terrible waiting for the one moment that asks you to move and to be right. You can only stand at your cart and watch the road and know what you know. So that is what I do. I sell chestnuts 11 steps from the south gate, and I am nobody, and I have seen the thing that whole show is for. I have seen the unmoving man become a child's only safe harbor. And every Thursday when the drum starts its slow heartbeat and the red coats come down the cobbles like a wound against the gray stone, I find Edrin Vale in the line, still as anything God ever made, ready as a loaded thing, and I lift my chapped hand to my chest, and then I open it toward him across all that cold distance, the way the boy taught me, the way I will teach my own grandchildren when they are old enough to understand it. Thank you for standing, for all the years you stand and nothing happens, and for the one cold Thursday when something did, and you remembered, faster than any of us, exactly what all that standing had always been for.